So now we can see people coming in slowly. And we'll start in a minute. Okay. Welcome everyone. Before we start, this session is going to be recorded for publication on our website of the German Council on Foreign Relations and on the WonkComms blog, but only the speakers will be on camera, so don't worry. And after having said this, the recording will start. And welcome again. Now that we are live, I'm Luzia Leifert. I'm the head of Impact and Innovation Lab at the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and your host today. And I'm very happy to welcome Leonora Merry from the Nuffield Trust and Joe Miller from Soapbox Design Agency with us here today. We are at the moment 25 people in this virtual room. Welcome everyone. Maybe just I'm going to see a couple of these organizations. Just feel free to post your names and your organizations in the chat so everybody else sees who's here as well. We are going to talk a little bit about a topic that is probably interesting for many of you. It's breaking through the noise, communicating authoritative information in a post-truth environment. And we are a little bit, before I'm going to delve into our topic and introduce our speakers more in depth, just a few words about this series. Today's event is the second one in a web series called Digital ThinkTanking. And we want to use this opportunity that we have here, where everyone is forced to work online mostly and from homes, to unite our different communities. So there's Joe here and Leonora, who come from the WonkComms community in the UK. And we have a lot of think tank colleagues also in the US. And there's our German growing think tank community as well. And all of us are in a similar situation right now. So we thought, instead of doing peer learning and events in our respective national communities, we could also bring it all online together. And this series is organized by WonkComms and the German Council on Foreign Relations and Soapbox together. Yeah, feel free to live tweet, of course. The hashtags are WonkComms and Digital ThinkTanking. And normally we have, yeah, it's me and Joe. We are co-hosts and we are taking turns. And today Joe is in a bit of a different role as a speaker as well. Yeah, now we're all set, and I think we are even more people, 32 now. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box and just write your name and your organization there for everyone to see who's around. Also, if you want to adjust your view to gallery view, you will be able to see all three of us at the same time. This is maybe more convenient for you. And a couple of words of how to participate. So we will have two inputs. Of first Leonora and then Joe, and then we will have time for Q&A of you. We will use the chat box for this. So whenever you have a question, just drop it in the chat and we'll take them at the end. And also we will work, we will ask you a couple of questions. We will have a survey upcoming now and more, just a feedback survey at the end to get to know you a little bit better. So while I'm posting this first survey for you, I will say a couple of words about our topic for today. Just feel free to answer the questions that are popping up on your screen right now. I hope you can all see it. Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah, so just feel free to vote, and then, and I'm gonna say a couple of words about today's topic. So breaking through the noise. The question we started out with was basically if the Corona crisis is also a communication crisis for politics and science, because all of us are in lockdown, and there's, you know, very little possibility to be in touch with our stakeholders, with the political community, with the public right now that we're all in our living rooms and bedrooms trying to connect through a more or less stable Zoom and Skype calls. And at the same time, you know, there's actually a big market for evidence and knowledge there. And there's been some evidence that also politics is looking much more to science right now for answers. In several countries, some scientists, especially epidemiologists and virologists, have risen to star and fame. And have been in the daily news. And in Germany, even a virologist was asked, you know, is he maybe the next chancellor to be? So this is happening at the same time where we see that there is an increased market for the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation through maybe WhatsApp channels, you know, people trying to fill the gap that the missing proven information has created. And so this is a situation that we find ourselves in now in this Corona crisis situation. So we were asking, what does all this mean for our communication as think tanks, often working as interpreters between the world of science and politics, and striving to provide politics with evidence. This is the reason why we invited our two speakers to share their knowledge with us. And so we're looking at the poll now. I'm going to end this now. And we will see the results. So how are you experiencing this situation? For most of you, the Corona crisis has, you would say that it changed the information environment that you're working in depending on the topic. So we will see also now how it goes in one specific think tank that is focusing on health policy. Interestingly, 5 of you even said that it has become easier to get the attention of your audience. So that's interesting. But for most of you, it has changed something. So this is really, really the starting point of our conversation today. And in terms of the biggest problem for you as think tanks, we just discussed this between us here before the start of the event. Of course, there are many more problems and challenges for think tanks right now. But when communicating information to policymakers at the moment, the biggest problem seems to be that all eyes and resources are on Corona, and all other information is pushed to the sidelines. Thank you very much. Yes, so now you should all be able also to see it. So yeah, as I said, the structure of today will be 2 inputs and then Q&A. And I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker, Leonora. Leonora is Director of Communications at the UK think tank, the Nuffield Trust, and she jointly leads a team of 10 communications professionals in disciplines from media relations and digital to events and marketing. She has been at the organization for the past 6 years, and in that time has increased the organization's media profile a lot. Prior to working at the Nuffield Trust, Leonora was head of media and external affairs at the Westminster think tank, the Social Market Foundation, for 3 years. And in that time, and this is something I'm very happy to say, she co-founded or founded the WonkComms community of communications and think tanks professionals, think tank communications professionals in the UK with 2 other colleagues. Leonora will share her observations today with us, leading the comms team at a British health policy think tank, which is probably more in demand now than ever. Our second speaker today is Joe Miller. And he is basically a philosophy professor turned communications professional. Joe is the director of the DC studio of Soapbox, which is a design and digital agency that focuses on communications for think tanks and research organizations. At Soapbox, he helps think tanks translate policy research into better digital products and help make those products more accessible through better websites. Before, he worked at the Century Foundation and the US Congressional Budget Office, so he also has firsthand think tank and public agency experience. And he also worked as a senior staff writer at factcheck.org. And of course, he was also, as I said, an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke and the US Military Academy. Joe will share his very practical knowledge advising think tanks. Be prepared for a dive into some of the technology behind the internet. And I have to say, when he showed us his slides before, I got a little afraid about the code that's on there, but he promised it will help you to present your work in a way that makes it findable at a time where everyone seems to move everything online. But be prepared, it might get a little bit gimmicky with him today. So I'm going to hand over to Leonora.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak to you. I'm going to talk really on three main topics, really. One is what the pandemic has done for truth and falsehood in the UK. Is my slides, can people see those? They look like they've gone a bit strange. Okay, that's better. The other is to give you a bit of insight into our own experience at the Nuffield Trust, because we do work on healthcare policy, so it's kind of thrown us into the centre of this in some ways. And then I've got some bits of advice on how to cut through the noise. I should say I have a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old downstairs who may come bursting in at any point, so that will be fun. It's very weird, this, talking to you from my bedroom, and obviously I'm here in London, so it's really nice to be here. So thank you very much. So first of all, talking about what has the COVID-19 crisis done for truth and falsehood in the UK. So there is evidence that bad information on COVID-19 is being widely circulated and believed by significant numbers of people. That's not particularly a surprise to anybody. Britain Thinks and Full Fact in the UK have been doing some really interesting work called the Coronavirus Diaries, where they've been looking at this. And, you know, we can all think of examples, whether it's 5G, COVID being transmitted by pets. I won't mention disinfectant to our colleagues in the US, but there are some interesting interpretations of truth out there at the moment. People know this, and people know that there is a high level of awareness of false and misleading information. So people are very, very aware of this, but just don't necessarily know how to get access to the right information. Something was quite interesting about the work that Britain Thinks and Full Fact had done was saying that people are more likely to believe stuff that backs up their views, basically. So you're more likely to think something is not fake news if it supports your views. At the same time, in the UK, and I think across the world, there's a very high level of trust in government, and that's a bit of a departure for us. We haven't had that high level of trust in government recently. And the health service, so we have a national health service, the NHS. You'll hear me talking quite a lot about the NHS. And trust in the government and the health service is very high. Trust in media is very low, with a few exceptions. Our national broadcaster has quite a high level of trust. And just my own perception, you know, there has been an explosion of data, charts and analysis as people are trying to make sense of the world around them. People are anxious, fearful. This is the fundamentals of life and death, and people are trying to understand what's going on. And there is intense interest in mortality figures, in bed numbers, in what's happening in care homes, and you know, this has created a kind of a frenzy of information around this stuff. But there are also real challenges, and I think this is the same around the world. There are data lags, there are comparability issues. So we've had, until yesterday, our government wasn't reporting deaths of people in care homes. So it's been very difficult to compare our mortality rates to other countries. And so there's a real kind of a cocktail of information going around, which means that people are very vulnerable to misinformation. So it's a kind of a very interesting environment in which to work in health policy communications. If we move on to the next slides, I'll give you a bit of a kind of overview of what we've been up to really since the start of February at the Nuffield Trust. So let me just get through. So as the disease outbreak started to increase, and you know, people realized it wasn't going to be something that was just you know, isolated to one region in the world, we started to be in demand for our kind of sense-making and responsive media commentary. It's been very strange in some ways working in a health think tank, because a lot of the things that we've been sort of earnestly talking about for, you know, years, and for some of my colleagues for decades, suddenly everybody's interested in. So we've been talking about pressures on health system capacity. We've been talking about bed occupancy levels. We've been saying that the National Health Service has got staffing shortages. We've been saying that we don't have enough beds in certain areas. So suddenly these things have been thrust into kind of everyday dialogue. We've been talking about problems in our country to do with how the health service interacts with care homes and social care, and suddenly these are all very much an area of focus. So it's a strange place to be, but also a very interesting place to be. In the early stages, a lot of the media commentary that we were doing was not based on our own analysis necessarily, although it was drawing on previous analyses we'd done, but a lot of it was about how will the health service cope with this? What sorts of things can the health services do to manage such a huge increase in demand? And we were very fortunate, we are very fortunate, we have a senior member of staff who has operational experience in the health service. So we were well placed to go out and do that kind of sense making. So we drew on that kind of deep system knowledge, and also we are a think tank who has quite a role in doing international comparisons, so how health systems compare globally. Our chief executive is an expert on that. So we found that there was obviously an overwhelming interest in our policy area and a lot that we can say, but we've also been very clear on what we don't have expertise on. We, for example, are not expert in how do you ensure that staff working in various settings have the right protective equipment. We don't have expertise in how that's developed, how it's got to the front line. So we've been very clear on that. I think it's really important when we're thinking about this era of fake news to make sure that we're not overstretching the limits, because we will be asked it. We are asked all the time things that are actually beyond our knowledge. Then sort of moving on really in terms of what we're doing, we've been doing, I think probably like most people who are attending this, a lot of internal work as an organisation to reassess our projects and think about how relevant they are to COVID-19. So some of the work we're doing is actually not able to progress because of it. So it would be requiring us to go out and do field work in hospitals with people. We can't obviously do that at the moment. And some of it will be relevant, but we'll need some tweaking. And so we're having a lot of live discussions internally and with our trustees about that. And what we're doing now, so having done a lot of the sense-making commentary, we're actually starting to shift a little now to looking at the policy implications of the crisis and what are the questions for the recovery. And I think the quote that I put up for the for this talk from me is that there is no business as usual. We're not going to go back to how things were a few months ago. I saw a really interesting statistic about the use of digital and online consultations, which it used to be that I think 9 in 10 GP consultations, so family doctor consultations in the UK happen face to face, and now 85% of them are online. We probably won't go back to them being predominantly face to face. In in the future, there will be things that do go back, but there is a big change, and that doesn't just apply to health. So we're talking about huge economic and social justice and welfare changes as well. So that's kind of what we've been doing. I'd be happy to answer more questions about that when we get to it. And just briefly, my kind of 5 bits of advice on how we can cut through the noise. And I should add a disclaimer, which is that nobody really knows how this is all going to pan out. We don't know we're in the moment in a situation where we're still in lockdown. We don't know when it's going to end. We don't know when schools are going to go back. So it's very hard to predict. But here are some bits of advice. So in this, think beyond the immediacy of the news cycle, but not too far beyond. So I've never witnessed anything like this. Our 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news, which are our flagship news programs, have every single item is an item that is of relevance to the think tank that I work in. But at the same time, the breaking news is very, very fast. So every hour there's breaking news, and it often is announcements that are coming out of government or statistics. And it's very difficult for a think tank to get in on those kind of breaking news stories. And we shouldn't really even try to be in some ways. But actually where we're really well placed is to think about what the questions are that flow out of those breaking news stories. So if it's a new announcement about a package of measures to support people, well, who are the winners and who are the losers? If it's an announcement on new initiatives for testing in care homes, well, what are the kind of issues for care home staff and the health consequences for those people? So it's those questions. I said not too far beyond, because things are moving so quickly. We're finding actually that an analyst will look at a piece of data and try, by the time they've written the blog, the data is out of date. So it's very difficult and very fast moving. The second one, I think, is a perennial WonkComms message, actually, which is don't be afraid of repackaging work and repeating things multiple times. I mean, us comms people say this to our researchers a lot, and researchers roll their eyes and want to be saying novel things all the time. But I think this is more important than ever in such a crowded and frenzied kind of news environment. We have a vital role to explain what this all means. Sometimes that explanation will be based on our back catalogue of work. So repackage those bits of analysis and those articles. I've said here for number 3, I've said use the time to plan ahead. So for some think tanks, you're not going to be as quite in the sort of white heat of it as we are at the Nuffield Trust. But that gives you an opportunity as well. It gives you time to plan ahead. I mean, I think most think tanks' policy areas will be in some ways affected by this. It's hard to see how you can't be, but you might be in a situation where you're planning for outputs over the next few months rather than days or weeks, which is in our case. And also share your thinking with your network. So we've done quite a lot of background briefings and talking to researchers, parliamentarians, journalists, just to kind of raise some of the questions that come out of what we're doing, because we're a useful sounding board for people as they try and make sense of what's going on as well. Number 4, I think I've probably already covered in describing what we did at the Nuffield Trust, or what we've been doing in terms of our own media commentary. So be upfront about the uncertainty. I mean, I think, that advice probably would be quite well heeded by politicians as well. I mean, nobody actually knows what's going to happen. We can't really say, but we have credibility by being a kind of not overstretching ourselves and not being political in this respect. So be upfront about the limit of your organisation's expertise. And the final point, which I think probably leads hopefully quite nicely onto what Joe's talking about, is if you are in lockdown, take advantage of that. I'm finding we've got our top spokespeople more available than they've ever been. My chief executive normally is delivering seminars, workshops all around the country, all around the world, and now there's he's around and is available to do media interviews and likewise for other spokespeople. I think a lot of organisations are already doing some interesting online events, much like this one. So, you know, the video software is there, so you can do really nice, interesting events. And you can do, I discovered yesterday, which I didn't know, I'm maybe far behind some of the, Joe will probably laugh at me for this, but I discovered that you can do, you can go into breakout rooms in Zoom, which is, you know, so there's a lot that you can do with the software. And there's also time for researchers to do extra bits and pieces of analysis and bespoke pieces for media outlets if that's something that is relevant. So it's not all awful, and there are some real benefits to some of the situations we find ourselves in. So that's all from me. I hope that's been a useful overview.
Thank you very much, Leonora, for sharing your time and your knowledge, even though, as you said, you're in the total heat of this situation here, working for a health policy think tank. And this is very valuable, I think, also for other think tanks, not exactly in that field, because as you said, it's hard to see how any other policy field, may it be economy, may it be international relations, all of it is like very much affected by the current situation. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Now we're going to hand over to Joe, who will both share his knowledge and his slides with us.
Present. Everybody see that okay?
Perfect.
Ah, lovely. Okay, so hello everybody, and thanks for coming out. So I want to start by saying that it is really lovely to be on a panel with Leonora again. So I don't think we have done one of these events together since more or less the first year of WonkComms. So this is a kind of a nice blast from the past. So it's, as Claire mentioned, I'm one of the directors at Soapbox, and one of the hats I wear there is leading content strategy work for various website projects. In practical terms,
a little bit.
That help?
Yeah, better.
Okay. So in practical terms, what that means is that I'm the person who interviews all of the internal stakeholders to help get clear on what people inside the organization want the website to accomplish. So you want to know the most common complaint I hear? No, you'll have to just wonder. Sorry, it's our search is terrible. So I'm going to let you in on kind of the dirty little secret of think tanks and search engine optimization. So the chances are pretty good that your search works just fine. It's your content that's the problem. Now, this is not because we think tankers are bad people or because we don't care about getting our work out. And it's not that we're bad writers. Oh, okay. So some of us are bad writers, but that's not really the kind of the underlying problem. The real issue is that our writers often don't really have a good understanding of how search engines work. So when we think about search, this is probably what comes immediately to mind. It's the 10 blue links on Google. But here's the thing, nobody wants links. Nobody goes out searching for a list of links. What they want are answers. So search engine builders know this. So they build out algorithms that attempt to figure out the question you're really asking and then return an answer. So sometimes that answer comes in the form of a list of links ordered by the probability that they lead to a page that answers the question being asked. But increasingly though, search engines just answer questions directly. So you see here's a result from Google. Remember this example, it's going to come up again later. But you can see this, this sort of giving answers directly even more clearly in digital assistants. So things like Alexa or Siri or Google Assistant. If you ask them a question, they don't return a list of links, they try to give you an answer. So understanding how they do that is key to getting your digital content in front of people. So that understanding starts with a story, and it's going to feel like a weird digression for a minute, but I promise it will, it'll be relevant eventually. So imagine that you're stuck in a room, and yeah, I know that's a real stretch right now to imagine, but you know, but in this particular room, the only way to access the outside world is through a mail slot. Every so often, a piece of paper gets shoved through the mail slot, and that paper has a bunch of markings on it. So when that paper with a bunch of marks comes in, You go to the markings in a book, and the books give you instructions for adding new marks to the paper, which you then push back through the mail slot. So completely unknown to you, the markings are Chinese characters. There's a person outside the room asking questions in Chinese. Your markings are perfectly reasonable answers to those questions. Now, to the person outside the room, it appears like you're having a conversation in Chinese, but you don't actually know Chinese. This particular story is called the Chinese room argument. It's a response to the Turing test. Those of you who've worked around artificial intelligence know what that is. But this argument was first articulated by John Searle, a philosopher with primary specialties in philosophy of mind and philosophy of language, and sadly a secondary specialty in sexual harassment. Searle basically made a career out of rewriting this same argument over and over for like 35 years. So we won't dwell on the specifics of the various versions of the argument, both because they quickly get really tedious and because Searle is a deeply terrible person. The basic point here is just that manipulating the structure of language isn't the same as understanding what the words mean. So this brings us back to our actual topic. Search engines are kind of dumb. They're really good at taking a text string, applying some rules, and returning some other text strings, but they have no idea what any of those text strings mean. Of course, not all is lost. You can't make search engines any smarter, but you can definitely make your content smarter. So what does that look like? So here's a blob of text. So unless you are Humpty Dumpty or you're a fellow humanities major who spent some Victorian literature, this is basically nonsense, meaningless text. But let's try something else. This should start to be a little bit more meaningful. So you now recognize that it's a poem called Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. You know this based on a bunch of visual and semantic cues. The thing at the top in the largest text is usually a title. You recognize that Lewis is a name and that when names follow titles, it usually indicates authorship. And the text formatting, those groups of 4 lines with indentations in every other line and larger spaces breaking up groups of 4, that usually indicates poetry. But now let's think about what happens when we put text online. And here's where the slide started frightening Claire yesterday, but I jumped right past it. Come back. Yeah. Eventually we'll get to the slide we're supposed to get to. Sorry.
Maybe Zoom is also afraid of the code.
It could be, yes. It really just didn't like it at all. Okay, so we're going to pretend. So we're going to so you might not recognize the code when it ever shows up, assuming it does, but probably a lot of you recognize this. So this is a WordPress interface for adding content to a page. You've got a title, and then you've got a big body field into which you dump content. So if you're like a lot of think tanks, you add content in exactly this way. So visually, you could style things so that they still look exactly like this. So still that nice same little formatted thing. But here's my code. I was just too early. So a search engine can figure out from this thing that the title is Jabberwocky because it's got that little title tag around it, but it's not going to be able to tell you much of anything else. To a search robot, every other piece of text on this page looks exactly the same. What's more, it's not analyzing your text visually. All those little NNBSP semicolon things just tell it that there are some blank characters. So this is a block of really dumb content. When you compare it with a dumb search engine, then you've basically got the equivalent of doing Control F on your screen. You'll be able to find exact text matches, but that's about it. So if you had a search query like, who wrote Jabberwocky, Google couldn't give you an answer using this page of text. Things don't have to be this way. Let's take a look at another example. Here's a pretty simple little page that you can imagine writing. Here's some HTML for how you could mark up that exact page. But this is, again, not very useful to a search engine because it doesn't know what any of the words mean. Even though you have written in there that your text, like plainly in the text, the Return of the King is the third volume of the Lord of the Rings, that doesn't convey any actual information to a search engine. But if we did something like this, now we're getting somewhere. So this is using a type of metadata called schema.org. So remember our Chinese room experiment with all of the books of rules? Schema.org is basically a big set of rule books that all the major search engines have agreed to use. So this markup tells a search engine that the page is about a book and an author, that the book is a trilogy named Lord of the Rings, and that the third volume of that trilogy is called The Return of the King. With this, you can ask a search engine, what's the third volume of The Lord of the Rings? Remember that slide from earlier? And it can answer the question. So it still doesn't know what any of those words mean, but it doesn't matter. You have replaced semantics with syntax, which is to say you've made your content smart so that your search engine doesn't have to be. Now, luckily there is schema information for pretty much every kind of content that think tanks post. You can, you'll note on here the ones that I have clicked on to use for various clients. A lot of those content types should look pretty familiar to us. They're the kinds of things we do every day. So getting this all set up does take some work, right? So for starters, you're probably going to have to give up your what you see is what you get editors and your big blobby fields where you do a bunch of formatting. You'll need to add structure to your content. But if you do it well, the results can be really cool. So, Alexa, ask Jabberwocky Poetry to read to me. Oh, you're not going to do it.
By Lewis Carroll. Was brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogovs, and the mimom raths outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought, so rested he by the tumtum tree, and stood a while in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock, with eyes of flame, came whiffling through the tulgey wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day. Callooh, Calais. He chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogovs, and the mome raths wabe.
Great. So that's what I've got. So thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Joe. Yeah, so as I promised, it was a little bit gimmicky, and we even had Alexa as a third speaker on a panel today. That was a first for me. Yeah, I think it was very interesting to see like both of yours, your perspectives. Leonora, you pointed to the things that you have to keep in mind when you're planning a communication strategy, and also how to keep your head above the water in such challenging times where really information and everything seems to be relevant, and how can you position yourself as a think tank. And I think Joe, your input was very interesting from a practical point of how to go about this situation where, as I said in the beginning, we basically don't really have the time and we don't have the possibility now in lockdown to meet our stakeholders in person and present to them what we think is relevant, but we have to find digital strategies how to present our information in a way that it's very easy to find for those who are searching for it without going through many different search terms and like clicking tens of links. So this is I think this was very relevant to this question, how to go about this. And now we would like to open the floor to everyone here in our virtual room, and I saw we're even more than earlier, so 35 people are here now. Feel free to post your questions in the in the chat box. And yeah, maybe just for as long as you're thinking about what questions you would like to ask from our two speakers, maybe let me ask first one to you. What do you think is the one thing that think tanks who are not in the field of health and who are really now struggling with getting attention and resources back to what is also important? I'm just thinking about the migration dilemma, you know, at the EU Turkish border, or because I mean, I'm working in a foreign policy think tank, all these multilateral institutions really trying to get attention, and the national response is kicking in first. So what do you think is like a way how we could change our way of relating to the public, or also just getting hold of policymakers in a different way than before? Like, how do you get in touch with them actually?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Claire. I mean, I think there will be, you know, think tanks in that situation will probably know better than I how to connect with their policymakers. I think perhaps though it's a bit about that taking advantage of lockdown point that I was making. So one of the challenges for us as a health think tank is that a lot of our stakeholders are actually people now who are working, you know, on the front line or managing people on the front line in healthcare systems. But if your stakeholders are not health professionals, if your stakeholders are other, you know, many of them will also be in this situation of remote working, and availability may actually be easier. So there is, you know, potential there. There are really interesting online discussions happening. You can do, you can do things like, you know, one-to-one interviews between senior members and policymakers. So there are kind of, yeah, different ways. And I mean, I can't really sit here and tell you how to do it best, but I don't think that just because people can't physically be in the same room, that means they are somehow less available. In some ways they might be more available.
Mm-hmm. And Joe, from based on what you presented, and everyone, please feel free to post your questions in the chat so we can take them up and ask them to our speakers. Joe, so what do you think from what you presented? I think this is already, it requires people who can work with WordPress, and this is probably something that many think tanks can do and can do internally. But what is maybe the one thing that you would advise people to do now to you know, improve the way they structure their online content, so that the stakeholders that they want to reach, the audiences, can actually find it?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, an awful lot of it comes down to just how you approach writing in the first place. So we have a tendency to, I think as researchers, we have a tendency to have in mind as an audience, you know, like when I was an academic, I thought about my dissertation advisor, you know, my colleague who might be reading this paper to peer review it for a journal. And so that's, you know, when people have gone through lots of schooling and spent a lot of time learning to write that way, there's a tendency to want to write for our peers. It's hard to make that shift and to try and think about writing from the perspective of the person who's going to be reading it, and really think about what questions that it is that they are trying to answer in the first place, and then make sure that you very clearly answer those questions. It's okay even to be really pretty literal and, you know, have a heading that just is the question you think people are asking, and then the paragraph that comes in after it just is the answer to that question. So even little things like that will, you know, when somebody puts into a search phrase, you know, a question, if that question is in a headline in your, you know, whatever it is that you have written, chances are pretty good that that's very high on the list of things that pop up. So it's really thinking from your audience's perspective when you create content.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. Yeah, we've had some discussions around this as well. I think all of this human-centered design is really also going into that direction. have your target group's question or problem, and start from that when designing whatever activities you are going to do as a think tank. Leonora, one more question to you. What was really interesting to me was what you said in the beginning about that think tanks have such an important role right now to explain what is going on and to make sense of things. So this really, for me, points to an increased focus on public dialogue as well, to like reaching the public directly, and instead of, you know, going only to policymakers. Do you think this is something that says, you know, there's a premium on talking to the public for think tanks right now in this crisis? Maybe also for think tanks who have focused on a very specific, more academic or policy audience so far.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and actually dialogue with the public is something we talk about in quite previous WonkComms events. Some think tanks do it really well, and some think tanks actually do more than, you know, do more than talking to the public. They actually engage very heavily with the public and try and kind of reframe the way that you know, the media speaks to the public. I'm thinking of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in the UK are doing some really interesting work on that. Others like mine don't really do public facing work. Our work is aimed at people running health services, policymakers. The sense making and explainer work is generally media and kind of generalist focused. So it's not really public focused, although of course it is, because it goes out to the public through the media. But it's making sure that if you're a journalist, and one of the things that we found actually with this crisis is journalists are being redeployed from other areas into you know, health specific topics that they know very little about, or they're having to quickly get up to speed on it. So if you're producing a piece for a news bulletin, or if you're you know, writing a piece for online or for the paper, you know, to have access to a nicely explained, digestible, well presented bit of content is really important, because, you know, you don't have time if you're that journalist to go looking through all the kind of academic literature on things. You might speak to people who have very different sort of political perspectives on things, and so actually being able to know, okay, if I go to this organization and, you know, I know that they'll give me the kind of the best interpretation of, you know, what this all means, it's really helpful. So I suppose that's where our kind of focus on the explainer side has come from. Of course, the end point of that piece of media is public, but it's also, you know, it's making sure that, you know, I think a large cohort of our audience are the people that pull together briefings for parliamentarians who themselves are generalists. They're not going to have the specialist knowledge, but actually knowing where to kind of get together the information that feeds into that briefing is really important. So
maybe to dive into that piece a bit more. So do you think that this is a point in time where actually think tanks should rethink who their audiences are, or do you think that it makes more sense to, you know, stick with who you know already, and then just try to, you know, make whatever you are doing right now adapted to the current situation, like not being able to do live events, just put them online, but still invite the same kinds of audiences, and speak to the stakeholders that you know best? What would you think? Or should we all try to reach out, you know, to more people, for example, right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a perennial dilemma for think tanks, because our audiences are quite ill-defined all the time, and sometimes an audience, you know, will realize that there's an audience for our work once it's been published, and it's quite unusual. We quite often have people, you know, come and work for us from membership organizations or charities where there is a very clear audience, whether that's members or beneficiaries. But for a think tank, the audience can be quite ill-defined. I think, and so the perennial question, you know, think tanks, the two think tanks that I've worked in, but I know through WonkComms this discussion is, you know, should we be broadening out? And you know, it's always an important question to challenge yourself with. The anxiety I have as a think tank comms person is it being quite sort of nebulous, or we want to talk to more people, we want more Twitter followers, we want more of this, we want more email subscribers, and actually well, to what end? What do you want them to do with your work? What is the sort of success of your output? Is, you know, that's the way to think about it, rather than just more and more and more. And it may be, you know, that, I mean, the public is a really interesting debate and an interesting one. And for us in healthcare, it's perhaps less about the public, but more about patients and making sure that we have patient voices in things. But you know, we're all not, you know, generally there are very few huge think tanks, and most organisations are resource limited. So that's, I think, probably for us as an organisation, and we've got about 40 staff. We use the media as an intermediary to get to larger audiences, because we just couldn't do it ourselves, really.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I think there are a couple of very interesting questions posted by our participants. So Charlotte Edwards asks, and this is a question to you primarily, Joe, I think. Have you seen much difference in search results depending on whether you use COVID-19 or coronavirus, especially in titles?
So it's a good question. I haven't actually looked it up specifically. I don't know if you can use, Google has a whole pile of tools that are available in either your webmaster tools or your analytics suite, and so those are you can actually look that stuff up pretty straightforwardly and just see kind of how which thing is getting more kind of more traction. There is always,
if I may add here, I even think that they're for free for nonprofits, right?
What's that?
I think some of the Google tools they have some packages for nonprofit organizations.
Yes, yeah. A lot of Google stuff is, at least at the basic level, is free for people to use. It can be a mixed bag. So the more popular a term is, you know, the kind of generally the more competition there is for it. So you can find the terms that are most used, and that's pretty straightforward to do. But then you are competing with a lot more, you know, a lot more people. So one way to do it is to try and find twists on it that are a little more unique, that you can pretty well own, because the chances that you are going to be able to rank first for a generic search on COVID-19 are pretty infinitesimally small. But the chances that you could, you know, rank first or second for economic policy post-COVID-19, that's pretty high. So you want to just kind of think really about what it is what question you're really trying to answer when putting those things together.
I think that Charlotte, she shared some of her own experience in the chat as well, and maybe Leonora, I don't know if you can speak to that as well. I think she was interested in seeing and in doing some A/B testing, and they even have done it to see, you know, whether, I think it's between those two terms that she's looking, is it either COVID or coronavirus? And this is interesting. So her test showed that including COVID was actually better. Have you done anything in that direction?
No, we've been too busy surviving. No, although it's interesting, when I saw the question, I thought, I had a quick look at the blogs that we've been publishing, and we started off with coronavirus and we've moved to COVID, which I guess is because it's become much more widely used.
I think also because it's shorter for social media and cross-posting, it's just a little bit more, you know, easier for hashtags as well and things like this. So there's another question from Helen Dempster. She's writing that we're seeing very little demand for non-COVID content. So this is something we covered earlier also. When do you think it will reach saturation point? When do you think people will want to read anything else? That's, I think, a point in time everybody is waiting for.
Shall I come in first on that?
Public news, I ask myself this every day. My partner really doesn't like to watch the daily news anymore because it's only COVID in Germany, at least. I don't know. Probably
so
another.
My bet, although, you know, we can watch this back and laugh at me for getting it wrong. My bet is that it will change once there is some kind of certainty, whether that's a vaccine that's actually successful, a treatment that works. It might ease off a bit once the kind of lockdown measures have been relaxed and have been proven to work? Because I know that you've got some interesting stuff going on in Germany. And the reason I say that actually is based on our experience in the UK regarding Brexit. So last year, there was a huge amount of uncertainty about whether it would even happen. Parliamentarians couldn't agree. We had, it wasn't just last year, we had, you know, an election with a hung parliament, and the enormous amount of uncertainty and the votes being lost, government votes being lost all the time. There was little else in the news. As soon as the election was called, the government got a majority and on a platform to make Brexit happen, suddenly it was not in the news all the time. And then, you know, we left the EU on the 31st of January, and then all this happened. So I think that it will be probably quite strongly related to any kind of certainty. And I think the reason, you know, journalists will continue to want to get the new angles on things while we're in this era of incredible uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. And maybe one last question from the chat that I would like both of you maybe to take up as a form of combine it with whatever kind of last statement you would like to make is, I think that's a very interesting one. So how do you deal with the issues that are polarizing and emotionally laden? And I think this is yeah, this is pointing also towards something you said earlier, Leonora, that this is really about life and death. And, you know, it's a bit of a different kind of policy debate. It creates a lot of insecurity in people, and what can be our role as think tanks? Like, you know, what role do you take in this situation? And maybe both of you can just share your perspectives.
So do you want me to go first on that one, or do you want to go, Joe?
Either way is okay.
Well, I've spoken a lot, so you go first.
Okay. Yeah, so this is, I'll admit, I'm maybe an outlier here in the think tank world, but and also again, I'm going to be a nerdy philosopher for a minute. But you know, David Hume, who was a 17th century philosopher, had this great line that says, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions." Right. So his basic premise here was that people are ultimately driven by emotions, and that reason can operate sort of in the service of those things, but that it's ultimately, until you really sort of cue into those emotions, you're not going to get anything happening. So it's not sort of as motivated sort of by pure reason. So I think often as think tanks, we want to pretend like that's the way policy is made, that it's made just in this, you know, kind of pure void, sort of emotional void, where we're all sort of Vulcans, just acting on logic.
Yeah,
but
basically
it's just not,
like providing the, you know, the funnel from statistics to law, you know.
Right. Yes. Yeah, and it just doesn't work that way. I think sort of understanding what those feelings are and kind of not taking advantage of them. That sounds terrible, but at least sort of being cognizant of them as you're writing and as you're approaching things, and not expecting people to just be rational all the time is kind of the way to go. So just, you know, just sort of put yourself in the position of somebody who is unemployed and has no idea when their business is opening back up, and think about, you know, as you're talking about, you know, sort of economic policy, these are the people who are affected by it. And so sort of bringing some of that into your work, I think, is a good way of trying to kind of bridge a gap that sometimes we just ignore a little bit.
Yeah, and I think just on a very practical point, in terms of if you've got people going and doing media commentary, you know, a lot of it is about preparing your spokespeople and having spokespeople who can kind of tread that line between, you know, yes, we're talking about you know, mortality figures, we're talking about graphs and charts, but actually we're talking about people's lives. And you know, that is just completely essential to have spokespeople who are able to kind of you know, remember that and keep that in the front of their mind whenever they're going on broadcast.
Okay, thank you very much for your knowledge and your time. I took a lot away from today. I want to start with the last thing that both of you just said, that this is really a situation of life and death, and as think tanks we should not take this lightly and not pretend that this is all about facts, but really people are people and humans. So our task would be to take the emotional side of the lockdown and the economic security and health and security seriously and speak to it in a responsible way. And also to think of how to repackage work and structure it in a way that we really start from thinking what might be the question that our desired audience is actually would want to type into Google search engine, basically take this question as a starting point and then structure your content accordingly and maybe even include this in the headline of your output of your article. So many more things I learned today. Thanks a lot. And we even had Alexa as part of our conversation, and I learned a little bit about how search engines are actually looking for information online. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to Leonora and Joe for sharing your insights. To all our participants today, keep coming. And if you found this useful, tell your colleagues about it. The upcoming edition of our digital Think Tanking web series will be next Thursday, the 7th of May, 4 to 5 p.m. Central European Time. And we will talk about the question, how do political processes change due to Corona? And what does it mean for our work as think tanks? We will be joined by Rainer Rudolph, diplomat with the German Foreign Service and senior fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and Will Tanner, director of UK Onward and former deputy head of policy for Prime Minister Theresa May, and potentially even a third person. If you haven't yet, register now for this upcoming talk. I'm going to post this registration link in the chat. And also, please post in the chat any other topic suggestions. So next week will be the end of the first slice of our series, but we intend to keep going, and we have a couple more ideas. But please post your topic suggestions and speaker suggestions in the chat here, and also let us know, of course, how to make the event and series more relevant to you. And last but not least, we would be very happy if you answer our very short feedback survey, just so we know if you want to come back, and you may want to tell your colleagues about it. Yeah, so this is it. And for everyone also who was also with us last week, I want to apologize. We didn't yet manage to send out the follow-up with the blog post, but there is a blog post on last week's event on WonkComms website already, and we will also share the recording with you. So stay tuned for sure. You will be in the mailing list anyway, so you will get this in any case. Thanks a lot, and come back.
Thank you.
Everybody.
So people are still writing in the feedback, and